And so my name is Bill Buchanan, and I host a podcast series on the world leaders in cryptography. And today I have possibly one of the greatest of all time, Ralph C. Merkle. Hi, Ralph.
Hello, Bill.
Great. So it's difficult to know where to begin, but I'll try. Ralph is the co-inventor of public key cryptography, the inventor of cryptographic hashing. He created Merkle Puzzles, the co-creator of the MerkleHelman knapsack cryptosystem, and invented Merkle trees, which are obviously the base of blockchain and cryptocurrency. He received his BS in computer science in 1974 from UC Berkeley and his PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford University in 1979. More recently, he is a researcher and speaker on cryonics. Ralph was a research scientist at the famous Xerox PARC Center and a nanotechnology theorist at Zyvex. He was also a distinguished professor at Georgia Tech, a senior fellow at IIM, a faculty member at the Singularity University, and a board member at Alcor Life Extension Foundation. In 1998, he was the co-recipient of the Feynman Prize for Nanotechnology for Theory, and in 2010, he received the IEEE Richard W. Medal for the invention of public key cryptography. And in 2011, he was inducted into the National Cybersecurity Hall of Fame. And in 2020, he received the Levchin Prize for contributions for fundamental contributions to the development of public key cryptography, hashing methods, Merkle trees, and digital signatures. That's a lot to take in. So where in the world are you just now?
I'm in Santa Clara County, which is in California, sort of the middle of California, right
Gotcha.
next to Stanford and a little bit south of San Francisco.
Ah, beautiful. And you've always been in that area?
Pretty
Why
much.
have you stayed there?
Well, I was born in Berkeley, and then my father moved to Livermore, and I grew up in Livermore, and then I went to Berkeley for my education, and then to Stanford. And then I had a career in California in the Bay Area. Spent a brief time in Georgia, decided I missed California, came back, and I've been here ever since. So, that's kind of the story, and
Excellent.
that's where I've been.
Yeah. So what's your current role and what does a typical day involve for you?
Well, I'm currently a senior research fellow at IMM, and a typical day is me using my computer to browse the web, look up some interesting research topics, and do some stuff. I've got some papers up on the imm.org website if anyone's interested, and you can look them up. They have a list of publications which are easy to put up, and that's where I go to put up stuff that I've done. We recently did a little piece on molecular field effect transistors. So me and some co-authors analyzed what would it look like if you had a really, really small field effect transistor. And the answer is you're down to, 8, 10,000 atoms, somewhere in that ballpark. Maybe you can go a little smaller if you're clever about it, but really at some point you start to worry about things like, well, how the gate is going to short circuit to the channel, and how do you prevent that? And gets really tricky at small sizes. So, at some point you have to be concerned about that stuff in a very fundamental way. We just used a bit of diamond as the
Yeah.
dielectric because,
Wow.
of course, if you're doing theoretical work, eh, you know, you can do that because you don't have to worry about the manufacturing at this point.
Yeah. When I did transistors, that was microns, and I think now we're looking at 4 nanometers. I mean, it's just absolutely tiny transistors, and it must be difficult, as you say, to create the dielectric so it doesn't start to short.
So creating dielectrics is very difficult at this point. In fact, the manufacturing process is the bottleneck. So if you really want to concern yourself with how do we do things like this, the key bottleneck is the manufacturing. And so you have to work on what is the manufacturing process going to look like. The other thing is that now the whole business is how do you get into three dimensions? So once you look at it, you start realizing that you're probably going to be dominated by wiring because you're going to have to run the wiring all over the place and you're going to have complex wiring. So how do you do complex wiring in 3D? And then the real one is what do you do about heat? Because if you have a large number of transistors running at any reasonable clock speed in a three-dimensional volume, it's going to get real hot real fast. So then you start looking at things like reversible computing to keep the heat down and under control. And that becomes real interesting real fast. How do you make everything reversible or as close to reversible as you can get? And that, that's how you do computing in the future because you don't have much choice in the matter.
Yeah. And so, what were you like at school before your graduate days? What were you like as a pupil at school?
Oh, I was absolutely wonderful, of course. I
Mm.
mean, no question about it. But no, seriously, back I was an undergraduate and I was sort of looking around for interesting stuff. And actually, this gets into the whole, what was I doing as an undergraduate back in 1974 and before? And the answer is I was looking around for something interesting to do. One of the things I did was take a course in fall of 1974, and the course was on computer security, oddly enough. So I took the course as an undergraduate, and we were supposed to do a quarter project. So I said, okay, I'll think about a quarter project. So I thought about the quarter project, and the quarter project that I cooked up was to work on something that had never been thought of before. And I submitted it. It was a 7-page project report. And the topic, I've got the project report in front of me. In fact, if you go to the website that I gave you, which is
Yeah,
ralphmerkle.com/1974,
yeah,
you'll find the project report. And the
mm,
topic was establishing secure communications between separate secure sites over insecure communication lines. And you can imagine what that sounds like today. And it's exactly what you think. Assumptions, and I'm reading from the report back in, or the project proposal back in 1974, assumptions, no prior arrangements have been made between the two sites, and it
mm,
is assumed that any information known at either site is known to the enemy. The sites, however, are now secure, and any new information will not be divulged. And then I walk into a description of the original version of the puzzles method, which I gather you're interested in hearing about and want to know the origins. So that would be the origins.
yeah, yeah. And I think you got some feedback from the professor who dismissed your ideas.
Yeah.
Why do you think he or she dismissed them?
Well, I can tell you. I mean, you're supposed to provide two projects, and my second project proposal was data compression, which I dismissed in one paragraph and said I wasn't interested in it. And he said project two looks more reasonable. That's the one paragraph description of data compression. Maybe because your description of project one is muddled terribly. Talk to me about these today, son, and you heard me just describe project one, both the assumptions, the topic, and the assumptions. So that was terribly muddled. Obviously, he didn't understand what I was talking about. And to some extent, you can forgive him because I was walking in on the ceiling, so to speak, because I was assuming that you could establish secure communications when everything was known. And that's obviously ridiculous because I was assuming that you did not have a cryptographic key that was known in advance. And that seemed absurd. How could you possibly do that? That's ridiculous. And that's the response generally I got when I tried to explain things to people. I knew that they understood what I was talking about when they'd say, "Wait, no, that's impossible. You can't do that." And when they reached that point, in understanding what I was talking about. I knew they understood what I was talking about. Until they said that, I knew they weren't listening. They hadn't understood what I was talking about. But,
Yeah.
it is quite paradoxical. I mean, it is literally the case that if you and I are talking, it's if everything is known between us and the enemy has heard everything and knows everything that we're communicating, how do we establish a secure communications link? And if you describe it properly, people will just realize that you can't do that. It's impossible. And then nowadays, of course, we know it's obviously possible. And because everyone knows it's obviously possible, they don't realize how impossible it is. So it slides down very easily. You say, oh, well, you have a reversible one-way function. You have these public key functions. And the explanation is so slick and so well polished that people don't understand the paradoxical nature of it, which is quite amusing. Um, but, originally it was simply rejected at a
Yeah.
level which was so fundamental that people didn't even realize they were rejecting it, which is,
Yeah.
interesting.
And I think you also submitted an IEEE paper on public key crypto.
That was
Do you
actually
remember it?
yeah, that
Yeah.
was communications of the ACM, actually. So I submitted that paper
Yeah.
to the communications of the ACM,
Yeah.
and that one was submitted. The editor was Sue Graham, and her expertise was not in cryptography.
Yeah.
She was an expert in compilers,
Mm.
and I knew her because I took courses from her in compilers. Um, and I had submitted to the communications of the ACM so I could, go and talk with her about it. And I submitted the paper to the communications of the ACM, and she sent it out for review by, proper experts in cryptography. And there were, as I recall, there were three of them. Two of them said, oh, yeah, it seems reasonable. And the third one, who was an expert in cryptography, put the kibosh on it.
Mm.
And he sent in the following response. He said, I am sorry to have to inform you that the paper is not in the mainstream of present cryptography thinking, and I would not recommend that it be published in the communications of the ACM. So this is the experienced cryptography expert. Experience shows that it is extremely dangerous to transmit key information in the clear. Now, what is Sue Graham going to do? She's a compiler expert, and this great expert in cryptography says that this is, not recommended for publication in the ACM. So she's got to turn it down, which she does. But I know there are a couple of things that I get from this. I mean, the obvious thing I get from this is, oh, hey, I've got this expert in cryptography telling me he doesn't recognize the idea. So right away, that tells me I'm onto something. I mean, I already thought I was onto something because I thought, hey, agreeing on a key publicly, with everyone listening, I've never heard of that one before. And then I get this cryptography expert telling me, oh, no, this is ridiculous. Reject this nonsense. And I go, huh. So now I've got a cryptography expert telling me that this is complete nonsense. And I go, oh, he hasn't heard of this either. Hmm. I must be on to something. So
Yeah.
my conclusion at that point was I had to keep the paper in the submission to the communications of ACM, and for a very simple reason. Once you submit it, they will publish the submission date.
Mm. Ah,
So I
yeah.
wanted that submission date.
Yeah.
And in order to keep the submission date, I just had to keep plugging
Mm.
and keep resubmitting until finally they accepted it. Now I knew they would accept it eventually
Mm.
because clearly this is a novel idea. I mean,
Mm.
the cryptography expert didn't recognize it, so it's a novel idea. So I figured, okay, I just keep revising it and revising it until eventually they fold, right? So that's what I did. I just kept
Yeah.
resubmitting and resubmitting. I figured I just had to make it simpler and clearer and more obvious. Now, it turns out some of the intermediate attempts to make it clearer made it bigger. and nobody accepted it anyway. What finally got it over the hump was Whit and Marty published New
Mhm.
Directions. Now they'd had their own troubles because
Yeah.
they'd published an earlier paper that, sank into oblivion. But New Directions was the one that finally caught on. People finally realized, oh yeah, there's something here. And after that, the next time I submitted it, the response was, oh yeah, of course, this is obvious. And I was very
Yeah.
amused by that. But I still had the submission date, which
Mm.
I can now point at and say, yeah, Communications of the ACM finally published it, and it's got a submission date, and you know, that's that's all to the good. But the fact of the matter is that as an undergraduate in 1974, everyone knows undergraduates can't come up with anything important. And everyone knows that, major new innovations come from somewhere else. Faculty members at Stanford, for example. So I had a hard go of it, getting anybody to listen. And eventually, when it was recognized that this was an idea which came from somewhere else, then yeah, suddenly then it was an okay idea and it was accepted and you get it in. But that's a major lesson.
Mm.
If you want to get a new idea in, it's hard
Mm.
because a new idea, first off, there are no words. In other words,
Mm.
when I submitted, there was no word like public key cryptography. You had
Yeah.
to describe the problem. And then there's also no prior literature. I mean, Sue Graham was telling me, hey, what's going on here? And she was particularly bothered by the fact there are no references to the literature. Has anyone else ever investigated this approach? If they considered it and reject it, why? In other words, if you've got a new idea, there's no prior literature, there are no words, and you'll be called in the carpet because you're not referencing the prior literature. What's going on here? You're an undergraduate. You're expected to reference the prior literature, have some clear explanation of what's going on. And if it's a new idea, you can't do that. You can't reference the prior literature. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So that's interesting, and that's a general problem with the whole refereeing process. The
Mm.
concept that refereeing is going to improve the quality of papers is an interesting one. You do realize that there is a refereed literature on the refereeing process,
Mm.
so that you can look up in the refereed literature whether or not the refereeing process actually improves the quality of articles. And the answer is no. Um, so if you believe that the refereeing process is a good process for improving the quality of the refereeing process, then you have to agree that it doesn't actually improve the refereeing process because that's the result of the refereed literature in the area. So it's quite amusing. At any rate, we've got this myth that the refereeing process is helpful,
Mm.
and it's not. What's really helpful is simply getting the articles out there, and then over time, articles that have an impact rise up and are
Mm.
referenced by everyone because, hey, that's what happens. And then the initial process of getting them out there is a real stumbling block. And the refereeing process can kill off new ideas and new articles right at the get-go. So that's the problem. What you really want to do is have a process that simply lets the ideas appear on the web. Nowadays, that's the way you want to do it. Back when things were published on paper, of course, you had the problem that there was a very limited amount of paper. So journals were printed and published, and there was a very strict limitation on journal space. But we don't have that anymore.
Mm.
So articles should simply go up on archive, for example,
Mm.
and then you can let the filtering process occur after they appear in the on the web. Anyway, that's a side light on the whole refereeing process, which I find to be not very well done.
No.
Um, so anyway, where were we?
Yeah. Can you explain Merkle puzzles? What was the
Oh,
basic idea behind them?
so the basic idea is pretty simple. I originally explained it, um,
Mm.
and the original explanation was this. Um, so if you've got two parties and they want to agree on a cryptographic key, the simplest method, if both parties simply guess at a key. So
Mm.
I guess at a key, you guess at a key, I make a whole bunch of guesses, and I one-way hash my guesses and send them to you, or you one-way hash your guesses and send them to me. And then if we happen to one-way hash the same guess, so I accidentally hit a key and you accidentally hit the same key and we hash them and I send it to you, then I'll notice that it's the same.
Mm.
That's the method. And the reason it works is that there's something called the birthday paradox. And the birthday paradox says if I guess n cryptographic keys and hash all of them, and you guess n cryptographic keys and hash all of them, and if the key space is um, n squared in size, then the probability of a hit is pretty good.
Mm.
So, and I think I phrased it as if the key space is n in size, then the probability of a hit goes up pretty high once you hit square root of n guesses on the part of each party. But that algorithm is very simple. I guess some keys from a limited key space. You guess keys from a limited key space, and then we compare the hash. And because the hash is compared over an open communications line, the enemy who's listening can look at the hash, but they don't know the key unless they exhaustively search through the key space. And that means the enemy is doing n squared work compared with my level of effort, which is n. So that's the original method.
Mm.
And as you can see, the original method is the kind of thing you could think of in an evening when you're trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, originally what happened is I thought intuitively that it's obvious that this idea of agreeing on a key over an open communications line when all of the information had been compromised was impossible. So my original thought was I'd simply prove that it was impossible, and that would be the end of it, and that would take care of it. So I spent an afternoon trying to prove that you could not agree on a key over open communications line when the both systems had been fully compromised. So I spent an afternoon trying to prove it, and I was failing miserably. So I had a hard time proving that you couldn't do it. And as I was trying to prove it, I kept running into this problem that both sides could use random information. And that seemed to be the sticking point in a proof, because if the two sides were predictable, then it was easy to show that you couldn't do anything. But if both sides had access to a random number generator, then the proof that you couldn't agree on a cryptographic key became more difficult because both sides had random number generators available to them, and that was bollocksing up my attempts to prove basically that you couldn't have public key systems. So I kept trying to prove it. When I failed, I said, well, all right, let's turn it around and try and generate a system. And that's the point where I said, well, if both sides have a random number generator, and that seems to be essential to bollocksing up the proof, what can you do with a random number generator? At which point I said, well, both sides can generate a random key, hash it, and send it to the other one. And that was the simplest version that I could think of. And that worked. Now, admittedly, there was the amount of effort that the enemy had to put in only scales as the square of the effort that the two people put in. But hey, that's something. So I realized that it's possible. And then I said, well, if that's possible, then you should try and do more. Now, the original paper or the original project proposal says method one, and method one is the method I just described that involves guessing. And it also has method two. And method two, under the same set of assumptions, another method of establishing communications appears, I emphasize appears, to be feasible. And I'm just reading from the project proposal.
Mm.
This technique would involve the conversion of a normal two-way encryption technique into an apparently one-way encryption technique. in many small, easy to understand steps. The resulting encryption algorithm would appear to be an incomprehensible one-way encryption technique. It would be equivalent, however, to the original two-way technique from which it was derived. The one-way technique would then be transmitted to the other site, which would use it to encrypt messages. The only way of decrypting these messages would be to use the two-way technique, which was retained by the original site. This method would also have advantages in other applications. For example, where there was a risk of capture and the possibility that any cryptological techniques used at a site would become known to the enemy. If a one-way encryption technique were used, with the original two-way version kept in a safe place, then the one-way version would be distributed to anyone who wanted a copy. I think such a method would require large amounts of computer time, minutes, on a medium-scale computer. In addition, I am unsure as to the actual success of such a program. Goes on. At any rate, that's a description of public key
Yeah,
cryptography.
yeah, that's amazing. And
That was my
what?
project proposal. And
Yeah,
that's what the prof at Berkeley turned
yeah,
down
yeah.
in
Oh, wow.
1974.
1974. So this was
Yeah,
probably 3 years before the
yeah,
Diffie-Hellman
yeah,
paper and the RSA
yeah, yeah,
paper.
yeah, yeah,
Amazing.
yeah,
So how
yeah.
did you hear about Marty Hellman and Whitfield Diffie's
Um,
work,
let's
and
see,
how
I'm
did
trying to
you come to
remember.
work with him?
I probably described this somewhere else. I think I think it was Peter Blattman.
Mhm.
I think. I'm not sure at this point. This was, let's see, this is 2025, and those events would have been from 1975 or something, a long
5 or
time
6, yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
76, yeah, it would have been a long
Yeah.
time, 40 some years ago. So,
Mm.
but I think that was it. You can probably hear, I probably described it somewhere else. So I trust my earlier recollections and my recollection now. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, basically, I had that as a project proposal in 74, which is, I think, very amusing. But you get the idea. I mean, the that project description was immediately blocked, and I had a hell of a time getting anyone to listen. But there were some occasional people. I'd like to say nice things about Bob Fabry, because when I showed Bob Fabry sort of an early draft, he took one look at it and said, "Hey, win fame, fortune, publish." So he liked it. He was teaching the operating system course at the time.
Yeah.
So that was very encouraging. But, we've got the whole refereeing process is not designed to allow new ideas to get through, which is a problem. You also have that problem with research grants. Research grants have committees, and committees kill new ideas. So
Mhm.
anytime you want to pursue something new, the first thing you should be thinking about is how do I get around the committee process? How do I do an end run on that? That's an important consideration at the get-go.
Yeah. And can you remember the problems that you had when you were presenting your work due to defense agencies trying to block it?
Um, I don't recall any problems from NSA or anything like that. I do recall problems from people who were trying be to act on what they thought would be helpful to NSA. I mean, Xerox, for example, they had contracts with NSA and other defense agencies. So they said, well, obviously they would like it if that there was a paper I published or tried to publish. And they said, obviously it would be helpful if
Mhm.
that was not published. Now, the problem was I had a paper and Xerox cleared it for publication. So there it was cleared for publication. I started passing it around. And then somehow Xerox decided, well, maybe we shouldn't be passing it around. So they came around to me and said, hey, that paper you cleared and you've been passing around, it's now uncleared. Stop passing it around and grab back copy. Oh boy. Stuff the toothpaste back into the tube. That didn't go over so well. So that was a problem. But no, I don't recall. I mean, NSA seems to be, hey, we're secret. We don't say anything. We don't do anything. We just keep a lid on everything in sight. But they didn't bring any overt pressure.
Mm.
But people trying to do what they thought NSA would be keep NSA happy. That seemed to be an issue. So I don't
Mm.
know. That's an interesting question. To what extent is that something that you can lay at the feet of government agencies, or how do you deal with that kind of an issue where
Yeah,
people are trying
yeah,
to do that? That
I suppose.
anyway, that was my
Yeah,
experience. I mean, I
yeah,
can't speak to
yeah,
anything other than a very narrow
yeah,
sort of view of what was going on, and did not
yeah.
did not have a larger perspective on what was happening.
I suppose there was this whole thing about export embargoes that you were actually selling secrets to the enemy so that they could actually keep things secure. I know that early versions of SSL were crippled because of that export
Yeah.
idea
Well, there was a
overall.
there was a whole thing about export and can you export stuff and
Mm.
keeping the key size small, and there was a whole debate about that. And I think, basically it sort of doesn't seem, I haven't been following that whole thing, but in the end, I think, how do I put it? I mean, basically providing good security is, I think, very useful, particularly in a democracy. You
Yeah,
don't want foreign powers selectively leaking information that they got from one side of the political spectrum in an attempt to disrupt our elections. So you
yeah,
don't want a situation where internal domestic communications are made available to foreign enemies who can then selectively leak information that they get. So you want good security domestically, so that foreign influence is not given undue ability to influence our own internal affairs. So that's
yeah,
that's obviously something that is important to us in our own political affairs.
yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, and you invented the Merkle tree, which is obviously the basis
Oh
of
yeah.
blockchain, which is quite an amazing invention. Could you just outline how it works? And at the time, did you know how significant it was?
Well, I knew it was significant, and I knew it was significant because it had the ability to function even if, how do I put it? I mean, at the time, I sort of told people that, well, even if the mafia computes the tree, it's still an accurate tree. So you
Mm.
can have the mafia compute the tree and it still works, which I thought was rather an interesting property. But yeah, basically, it's the logical extension of sort of hashing. And somehow I got to it first, and I'm not quite sure how that happened because I look at it and think, yeah, that's the right way to do it. How come nobody else did it sooner? And I don't know. They just didn't. But it's you have a hash function. Once you have the concept of a compression function, then hashing in the form of a tree. I mean, what trees are the most fundamental data structure around? So yeah, of course you want to hash it as the form of a tree, and then that leads to authentication paths, which are, following the nodes from the root to a leaf. And then you can do that. An authentication path is very nice. And then that leads pretty quickly to, figuring out how to regenerate authentication paths and stuff like that. So that whole thing was it was obvious to me from the start that it was fundamental, which is why I went after the patent. What was amusing is for some reason, it didn't seem to strike others as being fundamental at the time, and I'm not quite sure why. So I was chasing after the patent. I went to the Stanford Technology office to pursue the patent and said, "Hey, here's a shiny idea. We should patent it." And they said, "Well, okay. I mean, we'd just come off the public key patents." So they said,
Mm.
"Yeah, we'll take a flyer on Merkle if he thinks this is worth patenting." So I went ahead and wrote up the claims. One of the reasons it only has a few claims in it is that I didn't
Yeah.
know at the time that I should put in whole bunches of claims with lots of variations in the language. So I didn't sort of fully understand how you do the patent thing. So I just put in a few basic claims and I thought, well, that ought to do it. And then went into the patent office and said, here, let's patent this thing. And they said, whoa, okay. And the reason I think I'm the only one on the patent. So, and
Yeah.
that was because everyone else looked at it and said, yeah, sure, go ahead, knock yourself out. But I had this intuitive sense that this is a fundamental concept. So I did. And then, of course, it never got any large amount of money. I think they licensed it off to a couple of companies who were using it for various things. But, I never saw vast sums of money from it, which is, hey, that's the way it works. Um,
I
you
love
get,
that patent. It has five, I may be wrong, but it has 5 pages and you draw the Merkle
yeah, yeah,
tree and
yeah,
that's
yeah,
it. You just get in there and then you have your claim and it's a perfect patent.
yeah.
Anybody can read it. It's absolutely beautiful. And obviously the RSA patent made the inventors a lot of money. Do you think MIT was a bit more aggressive in terms of the protection of the IP than
I don't
Stanford
know. I
was?
mean, one of the things going on with the RSA patent is they actually went out and started a company.
Yeah,
And it took them a while before that company caught on. So, I mean, their model of how do you make money off a patent is you get the patent and then you form a company and then you just plug away for years on end while take flack from everyone. Commercial licensing flack, commercial flack, telling you that it's worthless and it's not going to catch on and why are you bothering with this? And they just did that. So they plugged away. Now I went off and did other things. So, hey, had I said, okay, we're going to make this thing valuable and we're going to look for
yeah,
applications and I'm going to start a company and work at it. I mean, that would have been the route to make money on that.
yeah,
But I didn't. I went off and did other things for reasons that I'll probably get around to discussing later,
yeah, yeah,
assuming we've got the time for it.
yeah,
But that's how you make money. Patents by themselves are not the road to riches. If you think you're going to patent something and then license it to someone for vast sums of money, that's usually not the way it works.
yeah,
Usually the way it works is you come up with something which is a valuable, company, and you create a valuable company, and then you use the patents or a patent portfolio to protect your company. So use it as part of barriers to entry so that you can keep the other giants in the area from crushing you.
yeah,
And then if you've got that, if you've got patents and you've got maybe some secret technology and you've got maybe a couple other barriers to entry that you put together, then you can use that. But the patent by itself in isolation is usually not the thing
yeah,
that makes you vast sums of money. There are exceptions. But usually, if you want to make vast sums of money, you have to do a coordinated sort of set of things. And usually it's centered around a company which is doing something of great value to
yeah,
society at large. Well, arguably of great value. There are companies that do things that people debate whether it's of value to do that, but nonetheless, they make lots of money.
yeah.
Um,
So obviously Xerox PARC invented so many great things. Ethernet, the mouse, the
mhm.
graphical user interface. Um, did you see any great inventions there when you were employed there?
Well, one of the things that happened is I think Acrobat was some of the people
Oh,
spun off that one.
yeah,
That time. A
PostScript and
lot of this
things.
stuff,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that was happening was that a lot of the stuff you're talking about happened earlier. So I
Uh,
got in a
Early
little bit after.
70s
Yeah,
for
yeah.
Ethernet. Yeah,
Yeah, and I was joining a little
junk.
bit after that.
Yeah,
So
it
I
was.
came there that we already had a bunch of stuff that was fun to use. One of the
Yeah,
things that they had that I liked very much is they had a windowing technology that wasn't the overlapping windows, but a grid layout.
yeah,
And this is a completely idiocy. It's one of the things that's always annoyed me about windowing systems that are in popular use today is they overlap the windows. And
yeah,
that's almost never what you want.
yeah.
Because
It's
why would
exactly
I
right.
want windows to step on each other so that
yeah,
another window comes up and I can't see what's on the window that's
yeah,
beneath it. I want the windows to be laid out so that I
yeah,
can see all the windows. And there are
yeah,
windowing systems that do that. They're just not very
yeah,
popular. And they
yeah,
had one at PARC, which I used and I liked very much. And, it's now not available unless you go to some trouble to find one of the systems that actually
yeah.
does that. And you work hard to get that on your system. So,
That's true. Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
the latest Apple iOS for the iPad is like that. You have
Hmm.
windows that just pop up and you're trying to get rid of them. And that difficulty in trying to lay the windows out is
Yeah.
really quite challenging, even in Windows. I can't remember if it wasn't X11 that they used or Star. I remember a Star word processor that Xerox had, but you can't remember the name of the graphical interface that they used at all. But
No, I know there was one of the guys who actually did it in
yeah,
the lab, and he was always saying, how the overlapping windows almost never does what you want.
yeah,
And that was sort of the mantra.
yeah,
But it was very nice.
yeah. And so, what was it like working at Stanford in the 1970s? It must have been an amazing time. There were so many amazing people and inventions that happened
Oh,
there. Obviously,
it
it
was
was
fun.
happening in MIT at the same time
Yeah, yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. It was fun. I mean, I remember some various things, but the whole idea of public key was new and people were kind of getting used to it. One of the things I remember is there was a talk, someone came around and explained that public key was totally useless, that the public key crypto systems didn't do anything because they didn't provide any advantage over conventional cryptography. And he gave this talk and I was very annoyed, of course. And he explained how worthless they were because, you had to have protocols, and the protocols, if you want to provide all the guarantees you want, use conventional systems. So that actually sparked me to write one of the papers that actually is fairly popular. It's Protocols for Public Key Crypto Systems. And the reason I wrote it is to explain to this ahem person who did not fully understand the issues in language that he could understand that he didn't understand what was going on. And so I sort of laid things out, and one of the things I did was try to explain in very simple language what the some of the opportunities were for protocols and explain it in very clear and very basic language. And I had in my mind a particular person who was failing to understand anything as I wrote the paper. And
Yeah,
apparently that's a very successful way to write a paper is to,
yeah,
try and describe it very clearly and very basically.
yeah.
So that turned out to be a popular paper
That's
among the
good.
various papers that I wrote. So I was amused by that. In hindsight, I really should try harder to make things clear and straightforward and apparent.
Yeah.
So
So students of computer science will know all about MD5, and MD
mm.
comes from the Merkle dam guard construction, and that was the creation of hashing methods. So can you just outline what this MD construction is?
Well, it's basically in my PhD thesis,
Yeah.
and essentially it's just a tree of hash functions, and then it's susceptible to a very straightforward proof technique where you just walk up the tree and say, hey, if you modify a leaf, then that's going to trickle down to the root.
Mhm.
And if you have the root, you can march up to the leaf, and if anything changes, it's going to show up in the root, assuming fairly weak some sort of security assumptions you make
Mhm.
on the compression function. So that was it. I mean, it was in my PhD thesis, and then people didn't notice it because nobody reads a PhD thesis. Come on, give me a break. And I hadn't run around and screamed at the top of my lungs about it because I thought, yeah, it is pretty straightforward. I just put it in and then failed to sort of do anything more about it. I thought the patent covered things adequately, but you know,
Yeah.
that was about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And could you explain the Merkle-Hellman knapsack method? And do you remember when it was cracked? I spoke to Marty Hellman about that, and I think there was an event that cracked it live. Can you remember the basic method that was involved?
Well, it was basically the issue was that the knapsack, if you have it and it's dense, then it's kind of secure. But as you sparse it out, then it becomes weaker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Adi Shamir actually spent a lot of time and deserves a lot of the credit for that.
Yeah.
Um, but the but if it's sparse, then it gets weaker. And of course, if you iterate the technique for making the knapsack multiplies by W mod m. And as you do this multiplication, it tends to sparse it out. And if you do iterated transformations where you use iterated W's and M's, then it makes it sparser and sparser. So as you make it sparser and sparser, you make it more vulnerable to the attack. So, but of course, the iterated version is supposed to make it stronger because it's harder to figure out exactly what's going on because you've done iterations. So you're between a rock and a hard place. If you iterate many times, then you've made it harder to figure out what the original was, but you've made it sparse so it's easier to attack. But if you don't iterate, then you've got not many iterations. So that was, that made it vulnerable to attack, and we hadn't realized that the sparseness of it made it vulnerable to attack. So that was an issue. And then I made the mistake of actually offering a prize for breaking a specific amount, and then I was stuck trying to figure out how to offer the prize. Now I didn't make that mistake in the hash functions. For hash functions, there's a very clean way of offering a prize for breaking a hash function. In a hash
Mm-hmm.
function, you say, hey, here's a hash function, and if you break it, a break is defined as having two inputs that hash to the same output.
Yeah,
And
collision.
that's a clean, yeah, you get a collision. And that's a clean way of defining a break.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's really easy to say whether someone broke it. If you find a collision, that's a break, you get your money. But on something like the knapsack, you don't have a clean way of saying it's a break. You have to have complicated decisions, and of course, it's hard to say whether you broke it. Now, when people offer prizes, sometimes they're not quite so, how do I put it? They hold out until it's been really, really clear that, it's absolutely been beaten into the ground. And I like, that's not quite kosher. So when it looked like it was, you know, weak, I said, okay, I'll pass along the prize.
Yeah. Good.
So,
Yeah. And what's reversible computing?
oh, reversible computing. Let's put it this way. If you have, um, if you're concerned about getting as much computing as you can, the first thing you realize is that heat is your big enemy. In a very fundamental sense, if you want more computing, then you really have to be concerned about heat. Now, if you look at a typical logic element has many inputs that produce the same output. And the moment you do that, it turns out that you are compressing the inputs. You're erasing information. And if you erase information, you are generating heat. And you can think about this. Suppose you have, and think about the following sort of analogy. If you've got a bit, and the bit is represented by a particle in one of two boxes. So you've got this rectangular box that consists of two squares, and you've got a partition between the two squares, and there's a particle, and the particle is in one square or the other. And depending on which square it's in, that's a zero or a one. And you've got a partition. Now, you would think that if you remove the partition and let the particle bounce back and forth, that that's erasing the bit. But that's not quite the whole story. If you have a bit represented by a particle in one partition or the other, and you remove the partition, then you've erased the bit.
Mm.
but you have to restore the system to its original state with the particle in the zero partition. You have to push it, say, to the left. That restores your system to its original state so you can now proceed to compute again. So a complete cycle involves removing the partition and then compressing the particle back into the left-hand partition. Now, removing the partition does not dissipate any heat. It just allows the particle to freely move between the partitions. But compressing the particle back into the left-hand partition, that dissipates heat. So that is a dissipative step, and that involves erasing a bit of information. So if you erase information, you dissipate heat. And if you run through your analysis, you find that you're dissipating natural log 2 times kT, where K is, you know, fundamental constant of nature, and T is the temperature in kelvins, or whatever unit you want to use it in. So essentially, if you erase information, you dissipate heat. Now, here's the tricky thing. You don't have to erase information to compute. And there have been a bunch of proposals for logic gates that don't erase information. But the granddaddy is the Fredkin gate. And the Fredkin gate takes 3 inputs and produces 3 outputs. And if you're given the outputs, you can figure out the inputs, so you can run the gate backwards and forwards. So that gate does not erase information. So it has 3 inputs, and the first input, A, is just copied to the output. So A becomes A prime, and then B and the C, the 2 inputs B and C, if A is 0, then B becomes B prime and C becomes C prime. So it just copies the input to the output. If A is 1, then B becomes C. So B prime is equal to C, and C prime becomes B. So you swap the second 2 inputs. And that's it. That's a Fredkin gate. And then the question is, how can you do computing? And the answer is, sure, you can do computing with Fredkin gates. You can compute by mimicking AND gates and OR gates and all those other things. The trick is, though, when you use Fredkin gates, you wind up computing what you want, but you also wind up generating garbage bits. So you wind up, if you compute with Fredkin gates, you wind up both with the result you want and a whole bunch of what are called garbage bits. And now what do you do with the garbage bits? And there's a whole literature on sort of how to deal with that and what to do. But what it boils down to is you can use reversible computing, which is basically computing with these Fredkin gates or some other model of reversible computing, but it's easy to think about Fredkin gates because they're a very specific and very concrete implementation. And then the Fredkin gates, because they don't erase information, can in principle be implemented without any energy dissipation at all. So if you can build your computer out of Fredkin gates, it doesn't erase any information. And then you look at today's modern computers, and they erase information all over the place. Basically, every transistor, every logic gate is erasing information. But if you redesign your modern computer so that it mostly uses Fredkin gates and then only occasionally erases bits, then you can drive the information, excuse me, you can drive the energy dissipation through the floor. And that's pretty much what we're going to have to do in the future as we want to reduce the heat generated by computers. I mean, we're already running into trouble. We're already heat limited. And as we try to get more computation, in particular as we go into 3 dimensions, I mean, just imagine a computer. Imagine say a cubic centimeter computer with molecular logic gates. I mean, I was talking about a molecular FET, which is, 10,000 atoms, say. I mean, imagine you've built a molecular computer that's a cubic centimeter in size, and it's using 10,000 atom molecular FETs, and it's interconnecting these molecular FETs, and it's computing away. you're going to have a lot of FETs in a small volume. And if you clock them at any frequency, you're going to have a lot of heat generated unless you do things reversibly. And if you do things reversibly, in principle, you can get the heat dissipation down to very low levels. So you have to really worry about that. And then you might be able to get a lot of computing in a small volume without having your computer blow up. Um, and if anyone's interested, they can look at the molecular FET paper. It's got links to a few other things. Or you can just
Yeah,
go to your favorite search engine, or you can ask ChatGPT, tell me about reversible computing,
yeah.
and it will tell you about all this stuff.
Excellent. So the burning question, of course, is that you were top in the field of cryptography, the co-inventor of so many things, but then you moved away into nanotechnology and molecular manufacturing. Why did you make that change?
So I had a realization. I was thinking about I was doing long range planning. So there I
Mhm.
was thinking about my future. And I'd graduated, I have a PhD, I'd gotten married, we'd settled down, we had a house, we had careers, everything was going wonderfully, life was great. I peered into the future, and what did the future hold? Well, if you do long range planning, eventually you realize you're going to die. You say, wait a minute, the future holds a gravestone? What?
Mhm.
What's going on here? This doesn't sound like the optimal outcome. Surely in this modern day and age of 1980, there are alternatives to this unpleasant possibility. So I started thinking about what the alternatives were to, dropping dead. And I started to realize that there were options. I just systematically went through and analyzed all of the available options. And my conclusion after looking at it was that cryonics actually should work. Now, this followed a period where I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the proper problem definition. I mean, one of the things that you learn in the research racket is you better define your problem correctly, or
Yeah,
you'll never get the right answer. I mean, that shows up real fast in public key cryptography. If you don't define it right, you're not going to get the right answer. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what is it that I want to do? What is this thing? Why, sort of the rough problem definition is death is bad and, you don't want to die. By the way, a lot of people find dying to be a wonderful thing, and they say dying is the purpose of life and stuff like that,
yeah,
which is kind
yeah.
of odd. But at any rate, I concluded dying was a bad thing and I wanted to avoid it. And when you think about it, what is it that you want to do? And I thought about it for a long time. I actually wrote a paper on it and concluded that what you want to do is avoid information theoretic death. And what is information theoretic death? Well, you have a brain, and your brain consists of, basically a complex computational system with synapses and neurons and all that stuff firing away. And your long-term memory is stored in synapses, changes in synapses. So those long-term changes in the synapses store your memories and your personality and who you are. And as long as that information that encodes who you are, as long as that information is there in some information theoretic sense, then you're not dead, not in any fundamental sense. If that information is erased in the information theoretic sense, as in it's gone,
Yeah,
then you're dead.
yeah.
So that's a straightforward definition. Now, the moment you apply that definition and you say, how do I avoid information theoretic death? and you look through all of the technologies that are available for life extension, you realize something very interesting, which is that none of the technologies for life extension actually prevents information theoretic death this year. In other words, if you take you, suppose you had a heart attack um, tomorrow afternoon. Um, Nothing prevents you from just keeling over and being gone, unless you're cryopreserved. If you are cryopreserved and your objective is to prevent information theoretic death, then it looks like cryonics successfully prevents information theoretic death. And it works right now. In other words, the technology required to cryopreserve you is available today. There are organizations who cryopreserve you. I'm signed up with Alcor. Um, and they can do that today because the technology essentially is to perfuse you with cryoprotectants and then cool you to the temperature of liquid nitrogen. And cryoprotectants, that's just fancy medical grade antifreeze. So you cool a person off to liquid nitrogen temperature, and then they sit in liquid nitrogen for however long it takes to develop a technology which would allow you to revive them and make them healthy again. Oh, well, you need a technology to revive them and make them healthy again. Gee, what would that technology look like? Well, if you look at the damage that is done prior to being cryopreserved and by the cryopreservation process, you're going to need a fancy technology. Why, you might even need to go in cell by cell, molecule by molecule, atom by atom to repair everything. Oh, gee, what would be a technology that could arrange the atoms, the very atoms, the way we want? And by the way, that's sort of a quote from Feynman from his 1959 talk. There's plenty of room at the bottom. So the answer is, well, you want a technology which is widely referred to as molecular nanotechnology. You want a technology that can arrange atoms. And that technology is, in fact, in the process of being developed. And that technology is one that I got interested in, oddly enough, because it allows you to arrange atoms and should allow you to arrange the atoms in your cryopreserved brain so that they are put back together again in a way which is healthy. And by the way, it should allow people who are in an unhealthy state generally to be restored to a healthy state. So the medical applications of molecular nanotechnology are going to be enormous, whether or not you are cryopreserved. It just happens that molecular nanotechnology, once we actually fully develop it, will be able to cure people in a wide variety of cases, even including cryopreservation. So my conclusion, so all of this hangs together. My conclusion was, oh gee, it looks like if you're cryopreserved, that will be something that is a technology which is available today. In other words, the front end of the cryopreservation process is something which is accessible today in terms of the technology. Once you're at the temperature of liquid nitrogen, you stay cryopreserved for, however long it takes. If you go ask cryobiologists, how long can you stay cryopreserved, how long can you stay at the temperature of liquid nitrogen without change? And they say, at least 1,000 years. So it looks like you can stay at that temperature for a long time. The cryobiologists will say, but wait a minute, if you're cryopreserved, there's damage done. And then they get kind of iffy about it because they say, well, how do we reverse the damage? And the answer to that is, well, you develop a technology that can literally go through and repair all the damage. And once you say that, then, the cryobiologists say, well, geez, I don't know about that technology. If you could do that, sure, you ought to be able to revive someone who's been cryopreserved. And that's it. That's the basics. And then once you understand that, you realize that, oh, yeah, you can go ahead and get cryopreserved. Now, that whole set of understanding, how do I put it? I mean, I'm talking with you today, and I'm assuming that various people in the cryonics community, excuse me, in the cryptographic community, they both begin with CR, so various people in the cryptographic community, CRY actually, various people in the cryptographic community are going to be listening to this talk and say, oh, yeah, gee, Bill is talking with Merkle. I wonder what he said. So they'll listen. And what they're going to say is, oh, Merkel's got a crazy idea. Huh, interesting. Well, the last time he had a crazy idea turned out to be right. So what I'm thinking is the people in the cryptographic community might actually listen to me. And there's a reason for that. I'm 73. And now that I'm 73, I am of an age where my friends are starting to die. So I'm beginning to be annoyed by this. And I'm annoyed because there's no reason for them to die because all they have to do is sign up with Alcor.
Yeah.
And Alcor will go ahead and you can sign up and you pay for it with life insurance. So it's not even all that hard. You sign up, you pay for it with life insurance, and then they'll cryopreserve you when you become legally dead. And then when you wake up in the future, a lot of people say, well, but if I'm cryopreserved, I'll be all alone in the future. Well, I'll be there, and other people at Alcor who've signed up will be there. And oh, by the way, Hal Finney will be there.
Wow.
Hal
Yeah.
Finney
Yeah.
was cryopreserved, right?
Yeah.
So Hal Finney of Bitcoin fame.
Bitcoin. Yeah.
Yeah.
First
So
Bitcoin miner.
exactly.
That would be
So,
amazing to speak to him. He would know who Satoshi Nakamoto
exactly.
was.
Exactly. So if you want to talk with Hal or you want to talk with me in the future, go sign up with
Yeah.
Alcor.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, look, I've done an analysis of this. I've got it on my website. So if you want to find out about the technical stuff, you can go to my cryonics webpage
Mm.
and look at what I've said. Or you can just go to the Alcor website. They've got a bunch of stuff that says, here's what's going on. And besides which, I'm just saying this thing should work, right? I mean, I went through the analysis. I went through the analysis back in the 80s when I was at
Mm.
Xerox PARC.
Yeah.
And I went through the analysis and I did a very simple thing. At Xerox PARC, I was in an undirected research slot, which meant that I could do research on anything. Now,
Mm.
I didn't figure I could get them to support me to do research in cryonics. That would be stretching it a bit far.
Mm.
But I did get them to support me doing research on nanotechnology. Because nanotechnology, that's kosher, that's
Yeah.
scientific. So
Yeah.
they supported me to do research on the nanotechnology, which I did. And also on the side, I also did research on the feasibility of cryonics. So I'd send off to the library requests for information on post-mortem changes in the human brain. And I'd look up articles, and I had a stack of articles a foot high on post-mortem changes in the human brain. There's a
Yeah.
whole literature on this subject, and you can just go through and read it. And what it basically says is that your brain, when you cut off the circulation,
Mm.
becomes rapidly non-functional.
Mhm.
But the structure is there and it probably remains there. I mean, if your long-term memory is synaptic, which
Mm.
all of
Yeah.
the neuroscientists seem to think it is, then it's going to stay there for, 12 hours, 24 hours. It looks like it's there for a long time. So if you get cryopreserved in that window after you're declared legally dead, then hey, it ought to work. Now, for reasons that escape me, you have to be declared legally dead. In other words, if I'm terminally ill and I want to avail myself of this life-saving technology, in other words, I say, hey, I'm terminally ill. I want to be cryopreserved because that's my best chance at survival. The response from the current medical community, like the response to public key crypto systems many years ago, the current medical community says, no, we don't do that. That won't work. Except that I think it will. And so they say, we're not going to help you. And because of that, Alcor, which is not beholden to that particular error, says, yeah, we will. But Alcor is not part of the standard medical community, so Alcor has to wait until after you're declared legally dead. But fortunately, there is this window after you're legally dead, and before the structures in your brain actually deteriorate, where you can be cryopreserved. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And that takes
I
care
suppose,
of it.
yeah,
So what
yeah,
I'm doing is I'm basically saying, hey, all you guys in the crypto community,
hmm,
come on,
yeah,
get off your
yeah,
duff. I'm
yeah,
telling
yeah,
you to sign up with Alcor because I expect to see you in the
hmm,
future. And a lot of you are my friends, and a lot of you I know of and I'm acquainted with. So, go ahead, sign up. You'll see Hal, you'll see me. And if the whole bunch of you sign up, you'll see each other.
yeah,
So that takes care of it. And I'm doing
yeah,
that now so that you all know it's on the table. Sign up. You'll all see each other and we'll
mhm,
all have a party.
yeah.
So
That
that's
sounds
it.
re That's really amazing. I suppose it's a bit like static RAM, SRAM, where you have little capacitors and they still keep their charge and then will
Yep.
decay over time. And obviously, the longer you let them discharge, the more of the memory you will actually use. So I suppose it's getting the right time so that you haven't had that leakage of your memory, the long-term memory.
Exactly.
It's quite an
If you wait
amazing
too
thought.
long, it's
Yeah,
gone.
yeah,
But if you act fast,
mm,
I'm guessing 12 to 24 hours,
mm,
probably longer, but I'm a conservative kind of guy.
yeah,
So.
yeah, yeah.
So, go
Yeah.
ahead and sign up.
Yeah. And I
So,
think
Bill, I'm
yeah,
trying to persuade you
yeah,
to sign up too. So.
yeah, yeah. Maybe I don't have enough money in my bank account just now to do that, but I might
There are
consider it.
ways you'll think about it. But
That's
hey,
right.
once it becomes fashionable. Well, look, what
Yeah,
I'm trying to do, I mean, one of the big
yeah.
objections is, hey, but if I wake up in the future, I won't know anybody. I
That's
mean,
right.
this is a
Yeah,
serious
yeah,
objection.
yeah,
Who wants to
yeah.
wake up in the future where they don't know anybody? So
No.
what I'm trying to do is say, hey, look, let's get a bunch
Mm,
of us and
yeah,
sign up together. And I'm saying we've already got a couple of people
yeah,
who've already done it.
yeah,
Me and Hal Finney.
yeah,
I mean, we're already, I mean, Hal is more than signed up. He's already
yeah.
cryopreserved.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
I'm signed up.
he had an unfortunate time before his death. I think
Yeah.
he had a serious illness.
Yeah.
I know
Well,
he
that's
had a
why you need to
difficult time.
sign up.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you want to deal with that kind of stuff, you got to sign up.
Yeah,
And it's very
that's right.
straightforward.
Yeah. So I think you've defined that mature nanomedicine could be the
Hmm.
key to good health. Could you
Yes.
outline how this field will develop over the next few years?
Yeah. Well, first off, we have to develop the nanofactories. So we need to develop the core technology to manufacture things that are atomically precise. And once you have that technology developed, then you can start to build medical nanorobots. And medical nanorobots, if you want to look up medical nanorobots, you can look on my web. You can actually go to IMM website,
Hmm. Yeah.
imm.org, and look up their publications. And there are various publications on them. There's actually, we put up a nanofactory roadmap, and that went up in the last month describing how to get to a nanofactory. That's an earlier roadmap, so it's a little bit out of date at this point. We've got better ideas now. But that describes the basic concept of how to get to a nanofactory. And then there are a bunch of articles on sort of nanorobots and how you can deal with various illnesses and medical nanorobots. You can also look up the website on that Rob Freitas has on nanotechnology. You can look up my nanotechnology website that has links to other places. And there are various websites around you can look at. But I would say, hey, the simplest thing to do is just go to the Alcor website, alcor.org, and start looking around. But it's real easy. I mean, nowadays with ChatGPT, my recommendation is just go to ChatGPT and say, hey, I'm interested in cryonics. Tell me about it. And what
Yeah.
about this Merkle person? What does he say about cryonics? And
Yeah.
just do those, ask ChatGPT those questions, and you'll get a lot of information.
Yeah. And apart from yourself, I think you've got quite a few famous people in your family. Can you outline some of them?
Oh, yeah. Well, my sister wrote A Vision of Light, which was a book. She was an author and published some various things. Actually, I guess the most famous person in our family is Fred Merkle. He's a great uncle. And
Mhm.
Fred Merkle had an infamous baseball play let's see, that was in 1908, I think. So
Wow.
all the baseball fans, every once in a while, someone will come up to me, Merkle, Merkle, are you a relative of Fred Merkle? And I say, yeah. And they'll say, oh, that Fred Merkle. Ah. But yeah, he was a great uncle. And he managed to, well, how do I put it? He was very sensitive about the subject.
Yeah.
Um, I never actually met him,
Mm.
but he was well known in the family, shall we say. And he played baseball and he lost the game by not touching second base.
Oh, oh
So,
dear.
well, what happened is he was on second. It
Mm.
was, I'm probably going to garble this, but he was
Mm.
basically on second. And someone came up to hit the run. They hit it into the stands. And instead of running to second, he saw the mob running onto the field because it was the winning run of the game and the game was
Yeah.
over and all of that. Instead of running to second and touching it, he walked back to the dugout. Um, and some guy on the other team got the ball and grabbed the referee and touched second and said, here I am touching second, and Merkle never touched second. So it was a force out, and that threw the game into a tie. So they had to do a end of game tiebreaker, and they lost the tiebreaker, and that was it. That was the game for the pennant. So
Yeah.
that I think it was in 1908. And so that followed him for the rest of his career. Um, and that was, there's even a song about it, uh,
Yeah.
which I have a copy of the song.
Yeah.
And the refrain is Merkle should have touched second base.
It's not the catchiest of lyrics.
Yeah. But so that's my famous relative.
Yeah.
I'm a piker compared with him. I mean, in the
Yeah.
crypto community, I might be known, but baseball,
That's serious. Yeah.
that's serious stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's
and my
good.
sister wrote some books that are, known among a small group of people who like
Mm.
books. My father ran Project Pluto. So
Mhm.
if you've ever heard of Project Pluto, that's a nuclear ramjet. And the
Yeah.
idea was that when it was first started in, I guess it was the 1950s, it was going to be one of the ways of delivering nuclear weapons to the then Soviet Union. And it
Yeah.
was going to be a nuclear ramjet, and it was going to have nuclear bombs in it, and it was going to fly around for, weeks, months on end. When World War III occurred, and it would fly around the Soviet Union throwing
Wow.
nukes out the
Wow.
side. And then when it was all over and it had thrown out the last nuke, it would crash in the last
Yeah.
finale.
Wow.
So he was working on the nuclear reactor that would be part of the ramjet. So they had a very successful test program to test the nuclear engine in the nuclear ramjet.
Mm.
And it was a successful test program. He ran the program at the Livermore lab. It was quite successful. And then, of course, after it was successful, that brought up the question, well, okay, we have a nuclear reactor designed to work in the nuclear plane, the nuclear powered ramjet. We should begin the next step of the program, which is to build the nuclear ramjet plane, right? So at that point, Congress had to decide, hey, do we proceed forward? And the answer was no, um, because when they had started the program, they weren't quite sure how to deliver bombs on the Soviet Union. By the time the program was done, they had a clear vision that there are missiles, there are bombers, and there are submarines. So they had the triad, what we now know of as
Yeah.
the triad of delivery systems. And once you have that, you're starting to say, well, do we really need another? And then the other question is, how do you test a nuclear ramjet,
Mhm.
which has got literally air coming in,
Yeah.
flowing over a nuclear reactor, and then flowing out the rear, so it's generating sort of radioactive air in the rear. how do you test that? So you've got this flying nuclear reactor in a test setup, which could crash at any point. How do you
Mm.
test that? You've got the risk of a flying nuclear reactor crashing anywhere along its path, and it's, got radiation coming out the rear end because you're literally running air over it. And, why do we need it? Because after all, we've already got other methods of delivering nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. So Congress said, nah, we're not going to continue with it. So it's a successful program that was then ended at that point. And of course, Dad was, I don't know, he was just as happy because he actually wanted to develop interstellar nuclear flight. That was what he wanted to do. Um, so he'd thought about nuclear powered interstellar flight, sort of as one of the things that he was interested in doing. But that was my father, and he was very well known
Mm.
at the lab. He was the associate director. He died of cancer, unfortunately, in 1966. So
Mm.
that left me on my own to sort of develop my own ideas about how I should live life and
Mm.
the purpose of life. So it turns out the purpose of life is to be happy. Uh,
Happy. Yeah.
yeah,
Every day.
exactly. And I think a lot of people agree with that. I think there are a lot of people who say that the purpose of life is to be happy. So that's the Dalai Lama says the purpose of life is to be happy. And I think, who was it? Was it Aristotle who said it was the purpose of life? There are a bunch of philosophers who say, yeah, the purpose of life is to be happy.
Yeah.
So apparently I'm in good company in thinking that.
Yeah. And I think Marty Hellman has a similar viewpoint, very much about the family as being the heart of happiness. And Marty
Yeah.
is a great advocate against nuclear weapons. I think he's campaigned against them. He retired quite
Yes.
early in his career,
He's
which
definitely against nuclear weapons. Well,
very
how can you
much.
be happy if you're vaporized by a nuclear weapon?
That's right. No,
There is this
that's
strong argument that says that,
yeah.
being vaporized is not conducive to happiness. So,
No, no. And we live in a scary world just now, so hopefully things will settle down quite
one
soon.
can hope,
Yeah. And so why
particularly if
did you?
people are protesting the
Yeah,
some of the advocates of scariness.
yeah, that's right. So why pick industry over academia? I mean, you could have been a top professor in a university easily, and you could have achieved all of your dreams of the nanotechnology. Why industry and not academia?
So academia has some interesting issues. One of them is that you have the committee-based process for grants,
Mm. Yeah.
right? And as I just pointed out, I have an aversion to the committee-based process because the committee-based process can be spiked by one person on the committee who says,
Mm.
nah, it's not a good idea. So if what you want to do is not within a tight circle of conventional ideas, then committees are not your friend.
Mm.
And in fact, I've talked with a number of people in academia who didn't even want to pursue research in nanotechnology, much less cryonics. And that was because they would have a hard time getting support. Now, interestingly, there was an attack on research in nanotechnology that came up because basically, oh, how did this work? This was some time ago now. Um, Basically, Bill Joy had an article on why the future doesn't need us.
Sun
Sun
Microsystems.
Microsystems, yeah, yeah, him. So he had an article where he said that we're all going to die, and we're
Mm.
all going to die because biological self-replicating systems are going to kill us.
Yeah.
Self-replicating robots are going to kill us. And there was one other thing. Oh yeah, AI. I think
Mm.
AI is going to kill us. I think
Mm.
it was probably, I'm probably getting this a bit confused. But at any rate, he had some articles saying we're all going to die from various things. So one of the things that was going to kill us was self-replicating nanotechnology.
Yeah.
We're all going to kill us. So he had this article come out, and then everyone got upset. There was actually an effort to get funding for nanotechnology,
Mm.
and molecular nanotechnology was going to get a piece of the pie as part of that broad umbrella funding. And because Bill Joy said, molecular nanotechnology is going to have a self-replicating manufacturing base, and it's going to kill us all, they wanted to have no part of molecular nanotechnology. So a bunch of the researchers in the area got together and said, well, obviously, replicating manufacturing is impossible, which I thought was very amusing. So they got together and said, yeah, it's all impossible. And that, of course, was a little bit of an issue if what you want to do is develop molecular nanotechnology. So that put the kibosh on the whole field for over a decade. I don't know. It's still trying to recover from that. But we're getting to the point where people can actually do some research in molecular nanotechnology at this point. I think people are beginning to realize that arranging things atom by atom is feasible. It's kind of hard to say that it's impossible to arrange things atom by atom when you've got scanning probe microscopes running around that arrange things atom by atom. And you've got various logos of various companies spelled out in atoms. So arguing that
Yeah.
that's impossible is a little bit disingenuous at this point. So, it's kind of amusing. But
Yeah.
that's serious stuff. I mean, the moment you start looking at funding and committee-based funding, you realize that committee-based funding really has some serious drawbacks. So
Mm.
you start asking yourself, how do you avoid sort of the committee-based funding mechanism? How is it you develop funding that does not suffer from this defect? I mean, don't get me wrong, committee-based funding is perfectly good for a wide range of research, but there's certain cutting-edge research that it's going to kill.
Mm.
Basically, really innovative research is going to just get decimated by the
Mm.
committee-based approach.
Mm. Yeah.
And the question is, how do you avoid that? Now, the problem
Mm.
is most of the mechanisms that would allow for um, funding really innovative research will also fund some really crazy stuff that turns out to be completely, wrong. So the question is, how do you fund stuff? And do you just take the hit and say, okay, we're going to fund stuff and 90% of the stuff we fund is just going to be a complete waste? Because if you fund stuff that's really innovative and the funding process is run by people who are, how do I phrase it delicately, not fully understanding of the issues involved, then they're going to have a lot of misses. So do you just take the hit, or do you try and develop some mechanism that allows for a more intelligent selection?
Okay, so what do you think are the key problems that need to be solved in your research field over the next few years?
Well, obviously, from the societal point of view, the big thing is the development of molecular manufacturing. I mean, at this point, everyone understands that AI is important and there's vast sums of money going into it. The next area that's going to be important this century is molecular manufacturing. And right now, there's essentially no money from a societal point of view going into it. There's a bunch of money going into things that are sort of peripherally related, but nothing going into atomically precise manufacturing, or very little going into atomically precise manufacturing. There's no coordinated program that's moving in that direction. So that's obviously a very valuable thing to pursue. And then once that's done, the other thing that I find to be very sad is that we now have, um, an annual mortality rate on the order of 55 million people a year, and they're all dying. And there really doesn't seem to be much of a reason for it. Obviously, if we were to cryopreserve those people, we would preserve, firstly, purely from a historical point of view, we could preserve much of the history of the era. Much of the history of this era is in people's brains. Anything that's not written down or discussed publicly is going to be lost. We could preserve that. We could preserve people's lives. If you cryopreserve someone, they'll be alive. They can wake up in the future and all of that stuff. And then from the societal point of view, developing the molecular manufacturing, as I said, looks like the next big thing to develop. And then we're going to be seeing people developing the other area, which I think is critically important, is governance. I tend to call it governance. But, you look around the world and it's pretty obvious that the governments of the world they range from flawed to completely insane. So the question is, how do we develop and then implement methods of governance that are, reasonably good? And I'm not asking for perfect. I'm saying, the current methods of government are, way below par. And how do we do something that is reasonable? People are, vigorously conflicted about them. Half of the country, well, in the United States, half the country thinks the other half is crazy. So I think there's general agreement that whatever we're doing is not perfect. And then the question is, how do you get something that's better? So those are the three areas I'd outline. The two that I think everyone will agree on are important are one, governance, everyone agrees is important. From a technical point of view, I'd say developing molecular manufacturing is important. It's not generally agreed on, but it is. A lot of people would agree on that. And then the whole usage of cryonics, very few people would agree that's important. But I think in hindsight, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, people are going to look back and say, how did they fail to save lives? Because, 300 years from now, lifespans are going to be much longer. Let me put it this way. Here's something that people can maybe relate to. A 10-year-old child has an annual mortality risk of one chance in 10,000. So a properly functioning biological human, a healthy biological human, as represented by a 10-year-old child, has one chance in 10,000 of dying each year. If you can if you can keep a person in good health, as good a health as a 10-year-old child, which should be possible as we develop our medical technology, then it would be reasonable to think that they would have one chance in 10,000 of dying each year, which would mean lifespans, on the order of 5 or 10,000 years. So a reasonable lifespan, if people could be in good health, where good health is defined as the kind of health you find in your ordinary 10-year-old child, lifespans of 5 or 10,000 years should be accessible. I mean, that's the kind of observation you make. We know that 10-year-old children are possible and stay in good health. And then we know that your health declines or your annual mortality risk goes up every year from the age of 10. So if we could somehow keep your health in as good a health as it was when you were 10 years old, then you'd live a lot longer. So in some sense, aging is the fundamental cause of mortality. And if we could figure out what's going on there and just keep you healthy, you'd live a long time. So, think about 5 or 10,000 years as being accessible if we could figure out what's involved in this aging thing and figure out how to counteract it. So that's sort of the argument. And that, a century or two from now, people are going to look back and say, hey, they really missed this huge opportunity. And they'll look at that and say that was the big opportunity that people missed. And look at the other thing. I mean, right now, we have, as humans, we've got what, 30, 40 years of useful life. And you spend 20 years, 30 years getting up to speed so you can pursue a career. And then you spend, a few decades in your peak years, and then you die. You retire, you get old, you're infirm, you're feeble, and then that's it. It's over. Now imagine if instead of having 30, 40 years at your peak, you could have 100 years at your peak, and instead of having 30 years to become educated, you'd had 60 years. You could learn a couple of different fields and learn them well. So instead of narrowly learning one thing, you could learn a bunch of things. I mean, we've kind of lost the idea of a Renaissance man, a person who knows everything. We don't have that. There's too much knowledge in the world. But if you lived for a few thousand, if you could live for a few thousand years, you could learn everything there is to learn, or at least learn most of what there is to learn. You could learn all the different fields. So we could bring that back. So, the opportunity we're missing is enormous. And I don't think people realize how big the opportunity is
Yeah.
because they have no experience of it.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
don't realize what the loss is until you've had the experience of it. And we won't have the experience for
Mm.
a while yet.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when people look back on this era, they'll say, "Oh, those poor people, those wretched people, they
Mm.
didn't know what they were missing. They lived such short lives. Why, they thought 80 years of life was
Mm.
all there was. They thought 100 years was a long lifespan.
Yeah.
How foolish of them,
Mm. Yeah.
how short-sighted of them. They could have had
Yeah.
so much more." So
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
that's my thought.
Yeah, that's great. And my last question is, if you could change one thing about your amazing career, what would it have been?
I don't know. It's hard to say. Difficult. I'm sure there are a bunch of things that have changed. Become rich at an early age. I mean, that's the usual thing people talk
Yeah.
about.
Mm.
But, you know, there are a lot of things, if I'd known them earlier, I would have pursued them more carefully. Um, so it's hard to say, but I think, looking at it, the key things in life are changing the opinion of the vast bulk of humanity.
Yeah.
Because that's what really counts, because
Yeah.
what the vast bulk of humanity thinks is important counts a lot. So, for example, which areas to pursue research in. The whole idea of choosing what to do research in is tricky because by definition, you sort of don't know before you do the research what you're going to get. So
Mm.
how do you pick the area of research? And the answer is on prejudice and stereotypes. So the areas of research we pursue are based on, you know, nothing. They're based on, well, prejudice and stereotypes.
What came
Uh,
before? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And what came before is a terrible predictor of what will happen in the future, the opportunities that lie ahead. So,
That's exactly right.
yeah.
Well, it's been an amazing opportunity for us to chat, and the impact that you've had in computer science is amazing, and it's great to hear your vision in so many other areas. So thanks very much for spending your precious time, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in the UK or in Edinburgh sometime soon, and just keep up the great work. Thank you.
Well, hopefully we'll see you in the future.
Yeah, in the future. Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.